Sarah Matthews clutched her worn duffel bag tighter as the Greyhound bus pulled away, leaving her standing alone at the dusty crossroads of nowhere. The small town of Cedar Ridge barely deserved to be called a town at all. A few weathered buildings lined the single main street, and beyond that stretched endless miles of high desert punctuated by jagged mountains that looked like broken teeth against the pale sky. 3 months ago, she had been living in a cramped San Francisco apartment, working double shifts as a nurse to pay rent that consumed most of her paycheck. She had thought things couldn't get worse until the diagnosis came: stage 3 breast cancer. The medical bills started piling up faster than her insurance could handle them. When she lost her job due to the extended sick leave, everything fell apart like dominoes. The chemotherapy had stolen her auburn hair and left her feeling like a ghost of herself. Her savings account drained to zero. The apartment she could no longer afford became just another loss in a long line of them. Her ex-boyfriend Marcus had disappeared the moment the word cancer entered their conversations, claiming he needed space to process. The friends she thought would rally around her slowly faded away, uncomfortable with the reality of serious illness invading their comfortable lives. Standing in the desert heat with nothing but a bus ticket to nowhere and $200 in her pocket, Sarah felt the weight of complete defeat pressing down on her shoulders. She had chosen Cedar Ridge randomly from the bus schedule, simply because it was far enough from San Francisco to feel like escape, but cheap enough for her dwindling funds. The sun beat down mercilessly as she walked toward what appeared to be the town's only motel. The Desert Rose Inn looked like it had seen better days sometime in the 1970s. Paint peeled from its stucco walls and half the letters on the neon sign had burned out. But it was shelter, and that was more than she had yesterday. The elderly clerk behind the counter studied her with curious but kind eyes. "You look like you've traveled a long way, dear," the woman said softly. Her nameplate read Dolores. "Longer than you know," Sarah replied, her voice hoarse from crying during the bus ride. Dolores quoted her the weekly rate without being asked, somehow sensing that Sarah needed more than just a night's rest. The room was small and basic, but it was clean and quiet. Sarah collapsed onto the thin mattress and stared at the water-stained ceiling, wondering what she was supposed to do next. Over the following days, she discovered that Cedar Ridge existed primarily because of its proximity to the Modoc National Forest and the small Modoc reservation nearby. The town served the handful of tourists who came to hike or fish, plus the native families who lived in the area. There wasn't much work available, but Sarah managed to pick up a few shifts helping Dolores clean rooms at the motel. It was barely enough to cover her rent and meals, but at least it was something. She bought her groceries at Murphy's General Store and ate most of her meals from cans heated on the hot plate in her room. The isolation felt both crushing and oddly comforting. No one here knew about her cancer or her failures. She could simply exist without explaining herself. 3 weeks into her stay, Sarah was sitting on the motel's small porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. The beauty of it still surprised her sometimes, cutting through the numbness that had settled over her like a heavy blanket. She had nowhere to be and no one expecting her anywhere. For someone who had spent her entire adult life rushing between responsibilities, the stillness felt alien. She noticed a small figure walking along the road toward town. As the person drew closer, she could see it was a child, maybe 10 or 11 years old, with long black hair and deeply tanned skin. The child carried something in their hands and their pace was unhurried but purposeful. When the child reached the motel, they stopped and looked directly at Sarah. "Are you the nurse lady?" the child asked in a clear, confident voice. Sarah blinked in surprise. "How did you know I was a nurse?" "My grandmother sees things sometimes," the child replied matter-of-factly. "She said a healing woman with sad eyes would come when we needed her most." The simplicity of the statement hung between them. Sarah felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't experienced in months. Curiosity mixed with something that might have been hope. "I'm Tommy," the child continued. "Tommy Crowfeather. My family lives on the reservation." "I'm Sarah," she managed to say. Tommy held up the object in his hands, and Sarah could see it was a small bow, clearly handmade. The wood was smooth and dark, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to tell a story. "My grandfather taught me to make this before he passed," Tommy explained. "He said the bow chooses its purpose, not the other way around." Sarah didn't know what to say to that. She had never been comfortable with mystical talk or spiritual explanations for things that seemed random, but something about this child's serious demeanor and the careful way they held the bow made her listen. "My father's been alone for 2 years now," Tommy said, their dark eyes studying Sarah's face. "Since my mother died. He's a good man, but he's forgetting how to smile. Grandmother says the healing woman will know what to do." The words settled between them like stones dropped into still water. Sarah felt a flutter of panic at the implication. "Tommy, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I'm not here to help anyone. I can barely help myself." But Tommy just smiled, an expression both ancient and childlike. "Grandmother doesn't make mistakes about these things. She says when people are broken in the right places, they fit together better." As the child turned to leave, they placed the bow gently on the porch railing. "This is for you," Tommy said, "when you're ready to understand what it means." Sarah watched Tommy disappear down the road, the evening shadows swallowing the small figure. She picked up the bow with trembling hands, feeling the smoothness of the wood and the weight of something she couldn't name. For the first time in months, she found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, she had ended up in Cedar Ridge for a reason after all. Sarah spent the night turning Tommy's words over in her mind like smooth stones. The handmade bow sat on her nightstand, and every time she glanced at it, she felt an odd mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She had come to Cedar Ridge to disappear, not to get involved in anyone else's life. Yet something about the child's quiet confidence had planted a seed of possibility she couldn't quite ignore. The next morning, she found herself asking Dolores about the Crowfeather family during their routine of changing bed linens and restocking towels. "Oh, you met little Tommy," Dolores said with a warm smile. "That child's got an old soul, just like their grandmother Elena. The whole family's well respected around here. Tommy's father, Daniel, he's one of the best fishing guides in the county. Takes folks out on the lake and up into the streams in the national forest." Dolores paused in her work, her expression growing more thoughtful. "Been having a hard time of it, though, since Rebecca passed. That was Tommy's mother. Cancer took her, same as it's trying to take too many good people these days." The word hit Sarah like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the dresser she was dusting, feeling the familiar wave of panic and grief that the word cancer always brought. "How long ago?" she managed to ask. 2 years this October. Rebecca was a teacher over at the reservation school. Sweetest woman you'd ever want to meet, and Daniel just worshipped the ground she walked on. They were one of those couples that made you believe in true love, you know? After she died, he just sort of retreated into himself. Still does his guiding work, still takes good care of Tommy, but the light went out of his eyes. Sarah finished her cleaning duties in a distracted haze. The parallels between her story and this Daniel's felt too pointed to be coincidence. Both of them touched by cancer, both of them struggling with loss and isolation. But where her losses had been relationships that couldn't weather the storm, his had been the deep, lasting love that made survival feel impossible. That afternoon, she found herself walking toward the reservation road, not entirely sure why. The bow felt smooth and warm in her hands. She had told herself she was just going for a walk to clear her head, but her feet seemed to know where they wanted to go. The reservation was smaller than she had expected, maybe 30 houses scattered along a network of dirt roads. Most were modest but well-maintained, with gardens and pickup trucks parked outside. She could see the lake beyond the houses, its surface reflecting the afternoon sky like polished metal. She was standing uncertainly at the main road when an older woman emerged from one of the houses. The woman moved slowly but with purpose, leaning on a carved wooden cane. Her gray hair was braided with colorful ribbons, and her dark eyes held the same ancient quality Sarah had noticed in Tommy. "You must be the nurse," the woman said without preamble. "I'm Elena Crowfeather, Tommy's grandmother." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm Sarah, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not really practicing nursing right now. I'm just trying to figure things out." Elena's eyes crinkled with what might have been amusement. "Sometimes the best healers are the ones who understand what it means to be broken. Come walk with me." Before Sarah could protest, Elena was moving toward a path that led down to the lake. Sarah found herself following, still clutching Tommy's bow. "Tommy told me about your conversation yesterday," Elena said as they walked. "That child sees things clearly, sometimes more clearly than adults who think they know better." The path wound between tall pines and opened onto a small beach where several boats were pulled up on shore. One man stood knee-deep in the water, teaching a small group of children how to cast fishing lines. Sarah recognized Tommy among them, but her attention was drawn to the man. Daniel Crowfeather was tall and lean, with broad shoulders and calloused hands that moved gently as he guided the children's movements. His black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and there were lines around his dark eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. When he looked up and saw Elena approaching with Sarah, his expression grew cautious but polite. "Daniel, this is Sarah, the woman Tommy met yesterday," Elena said simply. Daniel waded out of the water and approached them, water dripping from his jeans. "Tommy mentioned meeting you," he said, his voice careful. "I hope my child wasn't bothering you. They sometimes get ideas about bringing home strays." There was a slight smile with the words, but Sarah could see the wariness behind it. "No bother at all," Sarah replied, feeling suddenly awkward. "Tommy's very insightful." "That's one way to put it," Daniel said, glancing at his child with obvious affection. "Sometimes I think Tommy spent too much time listening to grandmother's stories." Elena made a soft sound that might have been disagreement. "Stories carry truth, Daniel. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it isn't there." An uncomfortable silence settled over the group. Sarah could feel Daniel studying her, and she wondered what he saw. A strange woman with short-cropped hair growing back from chemo, too thin and carrying shadows under her eyes that spoke of recent trauma. She probably looked like exactly what she was, someone running from something. "I should get back," Sarah said abruptly. "I didn't mean to interrupt your fishing lesson." "Wait," Tommy called out, splashing toward shore. "Did you bring the bow?" Sarah held up the carved piece and Tommy beamed. "See, Dad? I told you she'd understand what it meant." "Tommy," Daniel said, his voice holding a note of warning. "We talked about this, but Tommy was undeterred. The bow is for finding your way home when you're lost. Grandfather taught me that. And Sarah's lost, aren't you, Sarah?" The directness of the question, asked with such innocent certainty, made Sarah's throat tight. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "I suppose I am." Elena stepped forward and gently took the bow from Sarah's hands. "This bow was carved by my husband before he passed. He made it for our grandson to remember that sometimes the greatest strength comes from knowing when to bend without breaking." She handed it back to Sarah. "Tommy was right to give it to you. The question is whether you're ready to stop running long enough to learn what it has to teach." Daniel's expression had shifted from wariness to something else. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. "Sarah," he said carefully, "would you like to stay for dinner? Nothing fancy, just fish and vegetables from Elena's garden. But if you're going to be part of Tommy's mysterious plans, maybe we should at least get to know each other." Sarah felt something inside her chest flutter like a bird testing its wings. She had spent so long avoiding connections, afraid of being hurt or abandoned again, but standing by the lake with the evening light painting everything gold, holding a bow carved by loving hands and watching a family that had learned to keep functioning despite loss, she felt the first stirring of something that might eventually become hope. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Thank you." Dinner at the Crowfeather house was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in years. The kitchen was warm and filled with the scent of cedar and sage that seemed to permeate everything. Elena moved around the space with practiced efficiency, her cane resting against the counter as she prepared fresh trout that Daniel had caught that morning. Tommy set the table with careful precision, arranging mismatched plates and glasses as if they were fine china. Daniel had been quiet since extending the dinner invitation, and Sarah caught him watching her with curious eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. She felt self-conscious in a way she hadn't experienced since high school, aware of her too thin frame and the way her growing hair stuck up at odd angles. "Sarah used to be a nurse in San Francisco," Tommy announced as they sat down to eat, "before she came here to find us." "Tommy," Daniel said gently, "Sarah didn't come here to find us. Sometimes people just end up places." But Elena was studying Sarah with those knowing eyes. "What kind of nursing did you do, child?" Sarah hesitated, then decided honesty was easier than inventing a story. "Oncology. Cancer patients. I worked at UCSF Medical Center for 8 years." The silence that followed felt heavy. Daniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and she saw something flicker across his expression. Pain, recognition, or maybe both. "That must have been difficult work," Elena said quietly. "It was," Sarah admitted, "but I was good at it. I liked being able to help people through the hardest time in their lives until—" She trailed off, not sure how much she wanted to reveal. Until you got sick yourself, Elena finished not unkindly. Sarah's head snapped up. How did you— The way you hold yourself like you're protecting something tender. The careful way you eat like someone relearning hunger. And your eyes. They have the look of someone who stared death in the face and decided to keep walking anyway. Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes. She had grown so tired of hiding, of pretending to be fine when everything inside her felt broken. Breast cancer, she said simply. I finished treatment 4 months ago. Clear scans, they said. But everything else in my life fell apart. Lost my job, my apartment, my relationship. I guess I just needed to get as far away from all of it as possible. Daniel set down his fork entirely. Rebecca was diagnosed at stage 2, he said quietly. We thought we caught it early enough. Did 18 months of treatment, surgery, chemo, radiation, the whole nightmare. For a while it looked like she was going to beat it. Tommy reached over and squeezed their father's hand. Mom was brave, the child said simply. Like you, Sarah. I don't feel brave, Sarah replied. Most days I just feel tired. Brave isn't feeling strong all the time, Elena said, serving more vegetables onto everyone's plates. Brave is getting up each morning even when you don't know why. Brave is sitting at a table with strangers and telling the truth about your pain. The conversation flowed more easily after that. Daniel told her about his guiding business, how he took people fishing and hiking in the national forest. He had learned the trade from his father and grandfather, could read the water and weather like a book. Tommy chattered about school and friends, about the stories Elena told and the traditional skills they were learning. Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. The family's easy warmth with each other, their acceptance of her presence without demanding explanations or reassurances, felt like stepping into a hot bath after being cold for too long. After dinner, Tommy disappeared to do homework and Elena excused herself for her evening prayers. Sarah found herself alone with Daniel on the small back porch, both of them holding cups of coffee and watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. Can I ask you something? Daniel said after a long, comfortable silence. Sure. What made you choose Cedar Ridge? Of all the places you could have gone, why here? Sarah considered the question. Honestly, I closed my eyes and pointed at the bus schedule. I just needed somewhere that felt far enough away from my old life. I had no idea about the reservation or your family or anything. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Rebecca always believed that things happened for reasons, even when the reasons weren't clear right away. After she died, I stopped believing in much of anything. But Tommy— He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Tommy's convinced that you were sent here to help us somehow. And Elena thinks Tommy might be right. What do you think? Sarah asked. I think, Daniel said slowly, that grief makes people look for meaning in places where there might not be any. But I also think that you're the first person in 2 years who's made Tommy smile like that. And I can't figure out if that's coincidence or something else. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest, but it wasn't panic this time. It was the unfamiliar sensation of being needed, of mattering to someone. Your child is pretty amazing, she said softly. Yeah, they are. Sometimes I think Tommy's the only reason I kept going after Rebecca died. They needed me to be okay, so I pretended to be okay until it became almost true. How do you do it? Sarah asked. Keep going, I mean, when everything feels pointless. Daniel was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. Then he said, Rebecca made me promise something near the end. She made me promise that I wouldn't just survive losing her, but that I'd figure out how to live again. She said Tommy deserved to see what it looked like when someone chose life even after losing everything. Have you figured out how to live again? I'm working on it, Daniel admitted. Some days are better than others. But lately, especially since Tommy met you, I've been thinking that maybe I've been too focused on what I lost instead of what I still have. Sarah felt tears threatening again, but they were different tears than the ones she'd been crying for months. These felt cleaner somehow, like they might actually wash something away instead of just adding to the flood. I don't know what I'm doing here, she confessed. I don't know what comes next or how to rebuild a life from nothing. I'm scared all the time that the cancer will come back, and I'm scared that it won't and I'll have to figure out how to be a person again. Maybe that's okay, Daniel said gently. Maybe not knowing is where you're supposed to start. They sat together in comfortable silence, two people who understood what it meant to have their lives torn apart and be left holding the pieces. Above them, the stars wheeled in patterns that had guided travelers for thousands of years. and Sarah felt something inside her chest begin to unfurl like a flower reaching toward light. When she finally walked back to the motel that night, Tommy's bow tucked carefully under her arm, Sarah realized that for the first time in months, she was looking forward to tomorrow. She didn't know what it would bring, but she was finally ready to find out. Over the next few weeks, Sarah found herself drawn to the reservation like iron filings to a magnet. What started as occasional dinner invitations became regular afternoon visits, then daily stops to help Elena with small tasks around her house. The older woman never asked directly for assistance, but somehow Sarah always found herself washing dishes, weeding the garden, or helping preserve the late summer vegetables. Elena's kitchen became a classroom where Sarah learned to identify wild plants and their medicinal properties. Willow bark for pain relief, echinacea for immune support, chamomile for anxiety and sleeplessness. Elena's weathered hands moved with practiced certainty as she showed Sarah how to dry herbs and prepare tinctures. The white doctors have forgotten that healing is more than just fighting disease. Elena explained one afternoon as they ground dried sage into powder. Sometimes the body needs medicine, yes, but sometimes the spirit needs medicine too. Sarah had always been skeptical of alternative medicine, trained as she was in the rigid protocols of Western healthcare, but there was something comforting about the ritual of preparation, the careful attention to plants that had been used for healing for thousands of years. It reminded her of why she had become a nurse in the first place, the desire to ease suffering and bring comfort to those who were hurting. Daniel had been cautiously friendly but maintained a polite distance, as if he weren't quite sure what to make of her presence in their lives. He would nod and smile when she arrived, ask polite questions about how she was settling into Cedar Ridge, but there was always a careful reserve in his manner. Tommy, however, had no such reservations. The child attached themselves to Sarah like a determined shadow, chattering about everything and nothing, asking endless questions about her life before Cedar Ridge. Sarah found herself telling Tommy stories she hadn't shared with anyone, about her childhood in Oregon, about her decision to become a nurse, about the patients who had touched her heart over the years. "Why did you like taking care of sick people?" Tommy asked one afternoon as they sat by the lake skipping stones. Sarah considered the question seriously. "Because when someone is really scared and hurting, sometimes the most important thing isn't the medicine or the procedures. Sometimes it's just having someone who cares enough to sit with you in the dark." "Like Dad when Mom was sick," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "Yes, exactly like that." Tommy was quiet for a moment, then looked up at Sarah with those ancient eyes. "I think maybe Dad forgot how to sit with people after Mom died. He got scared that caring about someone meant losing them." The child's insight was startling in its accuracy. Sarah had noticed how Daniel seemed to hold himself apart, even from Elena and Tommy sometimes, as if maintaining distance could protect him from further loss. "Losing someone you love is really scary," Sarah agreed. "Sometimes people protect themselves by not letting anyone get too close. Is that what you did too? Before you came here?" Sarah felt her throat tighten. "Yes, I think it was. But you're here now," Tommy pointed out with simple logic. "So maybe you're not as scared anymore." That evening, Sarah was helping Elena prepare dinner when Daniel arrived home earlier than usual from a guiding trip. His clients had caught their limit quickly, he explained, and decided to head back to town. He looked tired but peaceful in the way that spending time on the water seemed to bring him. "Sarah, would you like to come fishing with us tomorrow?" he asked unexpectedly. "I don't have any clients scheduled, and Tommy's been begging to take you out on the boat." Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness. "I've never really fished before. I wouldn't want to be in the way." "You won't be," Daniel assured her, "and everyone starts somewhere. Besides, Tommy's convinced that you need to see the lake at sunrise." "The water's different in the early morning," Tommy explained excitedly. "Dad says that's when the fish are most honest about what they want." Sarah found herself agreeing, despite her uncertainty. The next morning, she met Daniel and Tommy at the dock, just as the first light was beginning to touch the mountains. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and water. Daniel's boat was simple but well-maintained, with comfortable seats and fishing equipment organized with military precision. As they motored out onto the still water, Sarah found herself mesmerized by the way the sunrise painted everything in shades of gold and pink. The mountains reflected perfectly in the mirror-smooth surface, creating a world that seemed to exist both above and below the water. Daniel anchored the boat in a quiet cove and began setting up the fishing rods. His movements were efficient and graceful, the result of years of practice. Sarah watched the way his hands worked, noting the calluses and scars that spoke of a life spent outdoors. The key to fishing, Daniel explained as he showed her how to hold the rod, is patience. You can't force a fish to bite, you just have to present what you're offering and wait for the right moment. Sarah felt his warm hands covering hers as he guided her through the casting motion. She was acutely aware of his nearness, the way he smelled like cedar and clean water, the careful way he positioned her arms for the best angle. Like this? She asked, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. Perfect, Daniel said softly, and she noticed that he didn't step away immediately after the cast. They fished in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the gentle lapping of water against the boat and the occasional call of a bird from the shoreline. Tommy caught the first fish, a respectable trout that fought hard before coming to the net. Sarah found herself cheering as enthusiastically as any proud parent. When her own rod bent with the weight of a fish, Sarah's heart raced with excitement and panic. "What do I do?" she called out. "Just keep steady pressure," Daniel coached, moving close enough to help if needed but letting her fight the fish herself. Don't try to muscle it in. Let it run when it wants to run, then bring it back when it gets tired. The battle lasted several minutes with the fish making strong runs that pulled line from the reel. Sarah's arms began to ache, but she found herself grinning with the pure joy of the fight. When Daniel finally slipped the net under a beautiful rainbow trout, she felt like she had accomplished something magnificent. "That's a beauty," Daniel said, admiring the fish's bright colors. "Nice work. Can we let it go?" Sarah asked impulsively. Tommy looked surprised. "Don't you want to keep it for dinner?" Sarah studied the fish, its sides heaving as it recovered from the fight. "It fought so hard. It seems wrong to keep it just because I was stronger." Daniel nodded approvingly and gently released the trout back into the water. They watched it disappear into the depths with a flash of silver. "Grandmother says the fish choose whether to stay or go," Tommy said thoughtfully. "Maybe this one had more swimming to do." On the way back to shore, with the morning sun warming their faces and a cooler full of fish for lunch, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: pure contentment. Not happiness exactly, but a deep sense of rightness, as if she were exactly where she belonged. "Thank you," she said to Daniel as he secured the boat to the dock. "This was wonderful." "Thank you," Daniel replied, his dark eyes meeting hers with an openness that hadn't been there before. "It's been a long time since I enjoyed fishing this much." As they walked back toward the house, Tommy running ahead with excitement to tell Elena about their morning, Sarah felt Daniel fall into step beside her. The careful distance he had maintained seemed to have dissolved somewhere out on the water, replaced by something warmer and more promising. "Sarah," Daniel said quietly, "would you like to go out again sometime? Just the two of us?" The question hung between them like morning mist over the lake. Sarah felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with possibility. "Yes," she said simply. "I'd like that very much." Their first real date was a disaster that somehow turned into the most perfect evening Sarah could remember. Daniel had planned a picnic dinner at a scenic overlook in the national forest, complete with a basket Elena had helped him pack, and a blanket that had belonged to his grandmother. But 20 minutes into the drive up the mountain road, his truck began making ominous grinding sounds and finally rolled to a stop with a mechanical wheeze. "I can't believe this," Daniel muttered, his face flushed with embarrassment as he lifted the hood to reveal steam pouring from the radiator. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I should have known better than to take this old beast on a date." Sarah surprised herself by laughing. "Are you kidding? This is the most adventurous date I've been on in years." In San Francisco, the biggest risk was getting a bad table at a restaurant. They ended up eating Elena's carefully prepared sandwiches, sitting on the tailgate of the disabled truck, watching the sunset paint the valley below in shades of purple and gold. Daniel had been mortified by the mechanical failure, but Sarah found his embarrassment endearing. It was such a relief to be with someone whose biggest concern was whether she was having a good time, not whether she was going to be too sick for whatever he had planned. "Tell me about your life before," Daniel said as they shared slices of Elena's apple pie. "What was Sarah Matthews like when she wasn't running away from everything?" Sarah considered the question, realizing how long it had been since anyone had asked about her dreams rather than her prognosis. Busy mostly. I worked long hours and lived in a tiny apartment that cost way too much money. I had this idea that if I just worked hard enough, saved enough money, did everything right, then life would eventually feel secure. Did it? Feel secure? Never, Sarah admitted. I was always worried about something, paying rent, getting ahead at work, whether my relationship was going anywhere. I thought the anxiety was just part of being an adult. Looking back, I realized I was so focused on controlling everything that I forgot to actually live. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Rebecca used to say that security was an illusion anyway, that the only real choice was between being afraid of uncertainty and learning to dance with it. She sounds like she was wise. She was. Sometimes I think she understood things about life that I'm still trying to figure out. Daniel was quiet for a moment, then looked at Sarah directly. Can I ask you something that might be too personal? After everything I've told you, I think we're past worrying about being too personal. Are you afraid of the cancer coming back? The question hit deeper than Sarah had expected. Terrified, she said honestly. Every weird pain, every time I feel tired, every time I have to go for follow-up scans, I'm convinced it's back. Sometimes I think the fear is worse than the actual treatment was. How do you live with that? I'm still figuring that out. For a while, I tried to pretend it wasn't happening. Like if I didn't think about it, it couldn't touch me. Then I tried to control everything. Eating perfectly, exercising religiously, following every possible recommendation to prevent recurrence. But that just made me feel like my whole life was about cancer, even when I was supposedly healthy. Daniel reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her palm. What helps now? Sarah looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how natural it felt. This, actually. Sitting here with you, talking about real things, not pretending to be fine, but also not letting the fear run everything, just being present for whatever's happening right now. When they finally got a tow truck to rescue Daniel's vehicle, it was nearly midnight. Sarah should have been exhausted, but instead she felt energized in a way she hadn't experienced in years. As Daniel walked her to her motel room door, both of them moved slowly, reluctant for the evening to end. Sarah, Daniel said softly, I haven't felt this way about anyone since Rebecca died. I wasn't sure I ever would again. What way is that? She asked, though her heart was already racing with anticipation. Like myself again, like someone worth knowing. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. You are worth knowing, Daniel. You're worth so much more than you give yourself credit for. He stepped closer, his hand coming up to cup her cheek gently. Can I kiss you? The question was asked with such tender uncertainty that Sarah felt her heart crack open. Yes, she whispered. The kiss was soft and careful, both of them moving like people learning a new language. When they separated, Sarah felt breathless and slightly stunned by the intensity of her response. Wow, Daniel said quietly, his forehead resting against hers. Yeah, Sarah agreed, unable to form more coherent words. Over the following weeks, they began spending more time together outside of the family dinners and group activities. Daniel would stop by the motel after his guiding trips, and they would walk the quiet streets of Cedar Ridge talking about everything and nothing. Sarah started joining him on his sunrise fishing expeditions, learning to read the water and understand the subtle signs that indicated where the fish might be feeding. Elena watched their developing relationship with obvious satisfaction, though she was careful not to comment directly. Tommy, however, had no such restraint. Are you going to marry Dad? The child asked Sarah one afternoon with characteristic directness. Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. Tommy, where did that come from? Grandmother says that when two people look at each other the way you and Dad do, marriage usually follows. Plus, Dad's been humming while he makes breakfast, and he only does that when he's really happy. It's complicated, sweetheart. Your father and I are still getting to know each other. Tommy looked skeptical. What's complicated about it? You like him, he likes you, you both like me, and Grandmother approves. Seems simple to me. Sarah couldn't help but smile at the child's logic. When you put it that way, it does sound simple, but of course it wasn't simple at all. Sarah found herself caught between the growing feelings she had for Daniel and the voice in her head that insisted she was being unfair to get involved with anyone when her future was so uncertain. What if the cancer came back? What if she died and left Daniel and Tommy to grieve another loss? What right did she have to risk their hearts when she couldn't guarantee her own survival? The internal debate came to a head on a crisp October evening, when Daniel invited her to dinner at his house. Just the two of them, with Tommy spending the night at Elena's. Sarah knew what the invitation meant, what Daniel was hoping might happen between them, and the knowledge filled her with both longing and terror. She almost didn't go. She stood in her motel room for nearly an hour, changing clothes 3 times and fighting the urge to call and make an excuse. But finally she looked at herself in the mirror and made a decision. She could spend the rest of her life, however long that might be, protecting herself and everyone else from the possibility of loss. Or she could choose to show up for the possibility of love, knowing that it might end in heartbreak, but that it also might be the most beautiful thing she ever experienced. When Daniel opened his door and saw her standing there, his face broke into a smile that made her decision feel inevitable. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi yourself," he replied, stepping aside to let her in. "I was starting to think you might not come." "I almost didn't," Sarah admitted. "But I figured if I was going to keep running away from things, I should have stayed in San Francisco." Daniel's house felt different with just the two of them there. More intimate, full of possibilities that hadn't existed when Tommy or Elena were present. He had cooked dinner himself, grilled salmon and vegetables from Elena's garden served by candlelight on the small dining table. "This is beautiful," Sarah said, taking in the careful touches he had added. Fresh flowers, cloth napkins, wine glasses that looked like they hadn't been used in years. "I wanted tonight to be special," Daniel said, his voice carrying a note of nervousness that she found endearing. As they ate and talked, Sarah felt the last of her reservations melting away. This man, who had lost so much and still found the courage to risk his heart again, deserved her honesty and her presence. Whatever happened in the future, she wanted to be here now, fully and completely. When he reached across the table and took her hand, she didn't pull away. "Sarah," Daniel said seriously, "I need you to know something. I'm falling in love with you. I know it's fast and I know we both have complicated histories, but I can't pretend otherwise anymore." Sarah felt her heart swell with emotion so intense it almost hurt. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. "And it terrifies me and thrills me and makes me feel more alive than I have in years." When he stood and held out his hand to her, she took it without hesitation, ready to discover what came next. The months that followed were the happiest Sarah could remember. She moved out of the Desert Rose Inn and into a small rental house on the edge of town, close enough to Daniel's place that they could see each other daily, but far enough to maintain some independence. The house came furnished with cast-offs from various residents over the years, mismatched but comfortable, and Sarah found herself enjoying the process of making it feel like home. She picked up more hours helping Dolores at the motel and started volunteering at the small clinic that served the reservation and surrounding area. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the clinic's only full-time physician, was grateful for Sarah's experience and immediately put her to work helping with everything from routine checkups to minor emergencies. "You're wasted in a place this small," Dr. Hernandez told her one afternoon as they cleaned up after a busy day of flu shots and school physicals. "With your experience, you could work anywhere." "I don't want to work anywhere," Sarah replied, surprised by how true the words felt. "I want to work here." It was true. The pace of rural medicine suited her in ways she hadn't expected. Instead of the rushing chaos of a big city hospital, she had time to really talk to patients, to learn their stories and understand their concerns. Many of the older native residents preferred traditional remedies combined with Western medicine, and Sarah found herself learning as much from them as she was helping. Elena had become an unofficial mentor, teaching Sarah to recognize and prepare medicinal plants that grew wild in the area. They would spend afternoons walking through the forest, Elena's weathered hands pointing out plants that Sarah had walked past dozens of times without noticing. "The land provides what we need, if we know how to look," Elena explained as they gathered willow bark from a stream bank. "White medicine is good for crisis, for when the body is fighting hard. But traditional medicine is good for balance, for keeping the spirit strong when the body is healing." Sarah had started incorporating some of Elena's teachings into her work at the clinic, with Dr. Hernandez's blessing. Simple things, recommending chamomile tea for anxious patients, suggesting guided meditation for those dealing with chronic pain, teaching breathing exercises that could help with stress and sleep problems. Her relationship with Daniel deepened steadily. They had found a rhythm that worked for both of them, spending most evenings together, sharing meals and conversations, taking long walks by the lake or through the forest trails. Sarah had essentially moved into Daniel's house by Christmas. Though she kept her rental as a studio space where she could retreat when she needed solitude, Tommy had accepted her presence in their family with the easy adaptability of children. Sarah helped with homework, attended school events, and gradually took on some of the parenting responsibilities that Daniel had been managing alone. She discovered that she loved the daily rhythms of family life, making breakfast while Daniel packed lunches, reading bedtime stories, having serious conversations about everything from algebra problems to friendship drama. "Are you happy here?" Daniel asked her one evening as they sat on his back porch watching the sunset. It was a question he had started asking regularly, as if he still couldn't quite believe she had chosen to stay. "Happier than I've ever been," Sarah answered honestly. "Sometimes I feel guilty about it, like I don't deserve to be this content after everything that happened." "Why would you feel guilty about being happy?" Sarah considered the question. "I spent so much time thinking that my life was over, that cancer had stolen my future. Finding out I was wrong feels almost too good to be true." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Rebecca used to say that guilt about happiness was just another way of hiding from life. She said joy was meant to be claimed, not earned. It was mid-February when Sarah's 3-month follow-up appointment came due. She had been dreading it for weeks, the familiar anxiety building as the date approached. The scans and blood work would show whether the cancer had returned, whether her body was still clear of the disease that had turned her world upside down. Daniel offered to drive her to the appointment in Sacramento, but Sarah insisted on going alone. She needed to face this part of her journey independently, to prove to herself that she could handle whatever news awaited her. The 2-hour bus ride gave her time to think about how much her life had changed in the past 8 months. She had arrived in Cedar Ridge broken and hopeless, convinced that survival was the best she could hope for. Now she was in love, part of a family, building something that felt like a real life rather than just an extended recovery period. The appointment itself was routine: blood draws, CT scans, a physical examination by her oncologist, Dr. Mitchell, who seemed surprised but pleased to see how much weight Sarah had gained and how healthy she looked. "Your color is much better," Dr. Mitchell observed as she examined the lymph nodes in Sarah's neck and armpits. "You seem more relaxed than I've seen you since your diagnosis." "I found a good place to heal," Sarah said simply. The results would take a few days, and Sarah returned to Cedar Ridge feeling cautiously optimistic. She had learned not to borrow trouble from the future, to focus on the present moment rather than spinning scenarios about what might go wrong. She was helping Elena plant seeds in the early garden when her phone rang with Dr. Mitchell's call. "Sarah, I have your test results." Dr. Mitchell's voice was professionally neutral, giving no hints about what she was about to hear. "Okay," Sarah said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Everything looks good. Your blood work is normal, and the scans show no evidence of disease. I'll want to see you again in 3 months, but for now you're officially in remission." Sarah sank onto Elena's back steps, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Thank you so much." Elena appeared at her side immediately, somehow knowing without being told that the news was good. "The land knew you were meant to stay," the older woman said simply, wrapping Sarah in a fierce hug. That evening, Sarah shared the news with Daniel and Tommy over a celebration dinner that turned into an impromptu party when neighbors and friends started stopping by with congratulations and potluck contributions. Sarah found herself surrounded by people who had become her chosen family, all of them rejoicing in her continued health as if it were their own victory. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Sarah found herself alone with Daniel on the porch where they had spent so many quiet evenings together. "I have something to ask you," Daniel said, his voice carrying a nervousness that made Sarah's pulse quicken. "What is it?" Daniel dropped to one knee beside her chair, producing a small box from his jacket pocket. "I know we've only known each other for 8 months, and I know your life has been turned upside down in every possible way. But I also know that I want to spend whatever time we have, whether it's 50 years or 5 years or 5 months, building something beautiful together." Sarah's hands flew to her mouth as he opened the box to reveal a simple silver ring set with a turquoise stone. "The dew stone came from this land," Daniel continued, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. Elena helped me design it. Sarah Matthews, will you marry me? Will you let us be your family officially? Through her tears, Sarah could see Tommy's face pressed against the kitchen window, grinning with excitement. Elena stood behind the child, her weathered face creased with a smile of deep satisfaction. Yes, Sarah whispered. Then louder, yes, absolutely yes. As Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms, Sarah felt the last piece of her new life click into place. She had come to Cedar Ridge broken and lost, but she had found healing in the most unexpected way. Not just in recovering her health, but in discovering what it meant to truly belong somewhere. Tommy burst through the door and launched themselves into the group hug, while Elena followed more sedately with a bottle of champagne she had apparently been keeping ready for this exact moment. Welcome to the family, Elena said simply, and Sarah knew she was finally truly home. The wedding took place in late spring, almost exactly 1 year after Sarah's arrival in Cedar Ridge. They held the ceremony by the lake where Daniel had first taught her to fish, with Elena performing the traditional Modoc blessing alongside the legal ceremony conducted by Judge Morrison, who had driven up from the county seat for the occasion. Sarah wore a simple white dress that Elena had helped her choose from a boutique in the nearest city, paired with turquoise earrings that had belonged to Daniel's grandmother. Daniel wore a dark suit with a bolo tie crafted from the same silver as Sarah's engagement ring. Tommy served as both ring bearer and maid of honor, proudly carrying the wedding bands in a small basket woven by Elena's own hands. The guest list was small but meaningful, the close-knit community that had welcomed Sarah and watched their love story unfold. Dolores from the Desert Rose Inn, Dr. Hernandez from the clinic, several of Daniel's guiding clients who had become friends, and the extended network of families from the reservation who had embraced Sarah as one of their own. But the most meaningful moment came when Elena stood before them to offer the traditional blessing, her voice carrying across the still water with the weight of generations. Marriage is not about finding someone to complete you, Elena said, her weathered hands resting on their joined ones. It is about finding someone with whom you can build something stronger than either of you could create alone. Sarah and Daniel have already proven this truth. They came to each other broken by loss and fear, and together they have built healing and hope. Elena paused, looking directly at Sarah. The bow that Tommy gave you was carved to represent flexibility and strength, the ability to bend without breaking, to aim true even when the path is uncertain. Today you become family not just in name but in the deepest sense of the word. You choose each other not because you need completing, but because together you can weather whatever storms may come. As they exchanged vows they had written themselves, Sarah felt the profound rightness of this moment, this choice, this life she had stumbled into when everything else had fallen apart. Daniel, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the water. When I first came here, I thought I was running away from everything that mattered. I didn't know I was actually running toward the life I was meant to live. You and Tommy and Elena have taught me that healing isn't about returning to who you were before. It's about becoming who you're meant to be after. I promise to meet each day with you as an adventure, whether it brings joy or sorrow, health or sickness, certainty or uncertainty. I promise to love you and Tommy and the family we're building together with everything I have, for as long as I have it to give. Daniel's vows were simpler but no less powerful. Sarah, you brought light back into a house that had been dark for too long. You taught me that love doesn't diminish when it's shared, it multiplies. You showed me that choosing hope over fear is an act of courage that gets easier with practice. I promise to protect what we're building together, to choose courage over safety, and to love you with all the strength and tenderness you deserve, today and for all our tomorrows. When Judge Morrison pronounced them married, the small gathering erupted in cheers that echoed off the surrounding mountains. Tommy threw wildflower petals that Elena had gathered that morning, and someone produced a fiddle that filled the air with music that seemed to make even the trees dance. The reception was held at Elena's house, with tables set up in the yard under strings of lights that Tommy had helped hang. Sarah's wedding cake was a collaborative effort, Elena's traditional fry bread layered with wild berry preserves, surrounded by smaller cakes that various neighbors had contributed. It was wonderfully chaotic and perfectly representative of the community that had become Sarah's home. As the evening wore on and the celebration moved into Elena's living room, Sarah found herself standing apart for a moment, watching her new family laugh and dance and tell stories. The contrast with her old life felt almost surreal. A year ago, she had been convinced that her story was essentially over, that the best she could hope for was to survive treatment, and maybe find some small contentment in whatever remained. Now she was married to a man who made her laugh every day, stepmother to a child who challenged and delighted her in equal measure, and part of a community that had welcomed her completely. She had work that felt meaningful, a home that was truly hers, and a future that stretched ahead full of possibility rather than dread. Dr. Hernandez approached her with a glass of punch and a knowing smile. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Crowfeather." Sarah tested her new name silently, liking the way it felt in her mind. "I was just thinking about how different everything is from what I expected a year ago. Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? Speaking of which, I have something I wanted to discuss with you." Dr. Hernandez's expression grew more serious. "I'm retiring next year, and the clinic is going to need a new medical director. I know you're not a doctor, but with your experience and the way you've connected with the community, I think you'd be perfect for the administrative role. You could oversee the nurses and physician assistants, manage the programs, maybe even expand the integration of traditional healing practices." Sarah felt a thrill of excitement at the possibility. "I would love to talk about that. This community has given me so much. I'd be honored to give something back in return." Later that night, after the last guests had departed and the dishes were cleaned and put away, Sarah and Daniel finally had a moment alone on the porch of what was now officially their shared home. The lake reflected the stars like scattered diamonds, and somewhere in the distance an owl called to its mate. "Any regrets?" Daniel asked, pulling her close against the evening chill. "Only that it took me so long to find you," Sarah replied, then reconsidered. "Actually, no. I think everything happened exactly when it was supposed to. If I had met you before I got sick, before I lost everything, I don't think I would have been ready to appreciate what we have." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around her. "I keep thinking about what Tommy said that first day, about people being broken in the right places so they fit together better. I didn't understand it then, but I think I do now. Our breaks lined up perfectly. Your cancer, my grief, both of us learning how to rebuild from nothing. We could understand each other's scars because we had matching ones." Sarah turned in his arms to face him directly. "Do you think Tommy really knew all along how this would turn out?" Daniel chuckled softly. "With that child, I've learned not to underestimate their intuition. Elena swears that Tommy has the gift of sight, like their great-grandmother did. Whether that's true or not, Tommy definitely saw something in you that first day that took me weeks to recognize." "What was that?" "That you were already family. You just didn't know it yet." As they sat together in comfortable silence, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here, the diagnosis that had seemed like an ending but had actually been a beginning, the bus ticket chosen at random that had delivered her exactly where she needed to be, the child with ancient eyes who had somehow known that a broken nurse and a grieving father could heal each other. In her pocket, she still carried the hand-carved bow that Tommy had given her that first evening. She had never really learned to use it for its intended purpose, but she understood now what it symbolized: the strength that comes from knowing how to bend without breaking, the patience required to aim for something you can't yet see, and the faith to trust that sometimes the most important journeys begin with getting completely lost. 5 years later, Sarah would still be cancer-free and running the expanded clinic that had become a model for integrating traditional and Western medicine. Tommy would be a confident teenager who had never known a day without feeling completely loved by two parents. Daniel would wake up every morning grateful for the woman who had wandered into their lives and stayed to build something beautiful. But tonight, on their wedding night, none of them were thinking about the future. They were simply present in the perfect moment they had created together, a moment that proved Elena right about one fundamental truth. Sometimes the greatest healing comes not from fixing what was broken, but from building something entirely new from the pieces that remain. As Sarah drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, she whispered a silent thank you to whatever forces had conspired to bring her home to a place she had never been before, to a family she had never imagined, and to a love that had taught her the difference between surviving and truly living.